Tested reading lesson, we're going to be talking about the social science passages, which make up a quarter of the passages on the ACT reading section. I'm Sophie Heller. Some may know me as the lady in the videos, and here I am in the flesh, as brought to you through a video medium. There are 4 types of passages on the ACT, and we don't really care about the other types since we're just going to be focusing on social science. And social science is a type of passage that scientifically studies human society and social relationships. So it's basically like sociology, history, civics, that kind of thing. So the social science section, as I said before, it's 25% of all the questions on the reading test because there are 4 passages on the reading test and it's one of the passages. It's the 3rd most difficult passage type to improve, so it's a really great place to start if you're just starting to look at the ACT reading. And there are a couple ways you can get better. So taking notes as you read. The social science passages often have a lot of dates and historical figures, so it's easy to lose track of that, so it's really good to take notes. You want to understand the question types as well. And we'll walk through it. This presentation will be based on getting you acquainted with all the question types you'll see on the social science passages. And you also want to understand the purpose of each paragraph. So a lot of times these essays are arranged in a very systematic way. So each paragraph will have its own purpose, will have its own main point. So understanding those purposes is really useful. And the 4th thing you want to do is look for bias behind objective claims. And that simply means you want to understand where the author is coming from. And you want to get a sense of the author's opinion so that that bias doesn't cloud your views. And so let's look at the types of questions. So there's 6 main types of questions on the ACT social science section. There's the main idea question, so basically the gist of the passage. The primary purpose of the passage is to blank. There's a vocabulary question, and contrary to its name, you don't really care about the definition of words. You care more about the context of those words in the passage. So which are the characteristics of self-contemplation, according to the author? And so we don't care here about what the definition of self-contemplation is. We simply care how the author is using this word to make his point. We have sequence of events questions. And so this is just telling you to look at the passage and see what occurred and in what order. So which of the following is something George did not do before leaving the country? We have hide and seek questions. And they're called that because you're really looking at the passage and trying to find hidden information. So the author compares A and B. You want to find where A and B are mentioned. Attitude questions. So this is like tone, opinion, just how the author feels and how the author uses the passage to present that information. So what values are reflected in the narrative provided by the author? And technique question. So this is more about rhetorical devices or the way that the author uses writing. So not exactly an opinion, but how the writing is accomplishing the purpose of the author's passage. So violence is represented by blank. So I'm going to give you a passage here, and this is a passage from a real ACT. It has to deal with some really scintillating information about labor practices. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to read it. So this lesson, you'll benefit most from this lesson if you actually take the time to read all of this passage. And so I want you to pause here. You can also see, if you click this link below, you can see some bigger text. And let me know when you're finished, or don't let me know. I will pause and we will restart. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've paused and you've had time to read the passage. And so let's proceed with the different types of questions in context of this passage. So let's look first at our main idea questions. So as I said before, the main idea questions are like the primary purpose of this passage is to, the main idea of the last paragraph is to. So sometimes they're not just the full passage, they're specific parts of the passage. Or the passage is primarily concerned with blank. And here's some strategies. So you don't want to reread. If you're rereading the passage, it means that you weren't reading closely enough to begin with. And the ACT is so focused on time, you don't want to waste time rereading. True does not equal correct. So a lot of trap answers will include something that is true and is backed up by the passage, but it's not the purpose, so it's not the right answer. So you want to be really careful of these kind of red herring answers. And you want to address the whole passage. So the trap answers will often focus on too narrow a scope. So just the last paragraph, for example. And it's a really good trap because it's the last thing you read. But you want to make sure that we're talking about the entire 80 or so lines of the passage and not just one paragraph. Here's an example from that text you just read. So let's look at our question. Which observation is the most appropriate conclusion that can be drawn from the author's text? So since we don't know what these observations are, we want to go through and we want to see what construes what goes along best with what the author has said. And we know that this, just to refresh, this passage is talking about labor practices and how they changed from the Industrial Revolution through to the present. So choice one. Some of the justices on the Supreme Court had difficulty in persuading most of the justices that legislation should be upheld when the social welfare of the nation was at stake. So I'd argue to say that we don't really see that here because we see a difference between some justices and other justices. We also don't see the idea of social welfare and the nation was at stake. This is just a lot of things in here that aren't quite true. So I'd say that this cancels out the entire answer choice. Choice two. Congressional leaders failed to persuade most of the members of the House and the Senate that legislation should be passed in order to protect the social welfare of the nation. So same thing as choice one. We don't see mention of the House or Senate. We don't see that we're trying to protect the social welfare of the nation, and we don't see any persuasion happening. It's not good. Choice three. The passage above is an excellent illustration of how the legislative branch and the judicial branch can lose their identities in the face of strong voter appeal in working class neighborhoods. So it's another place where we don't see the legislative branch, we don't see the judicial branch, and we don't see working class neighborhoods. So we want to remember we see issues in the workplace, we see issues with workers, but we're not talking about working class neighborhoods. So it's more of a distinction of employment and less one of socioeconomic locations. We're left with choice D, and process of elimination is a really, really great tool on the ACT. It's just as valid because it'll allow you to reach the correct answer by getting rid of all the bad answers, but I'm still going to explain whenever we come to a choice D, I'll explain what's happening just so you understand how you could arrive at this answer of your own accord. So we see Young Rubin's case was first filed in the trial court in 1918, was not decided until 1923. Too late to help the child labor. So we see Young Rubin's case in this paragraph here. We see the Rubin Dagenhart, and his case was first given in 1918, but we see that in 1923, it was only decided in 1923, and that was way too late for child laborers. So choice number 4 is going to be good. Let's move on to a different question type. Vocabulary questions. So as I said before, vocabulary questions are not based on the definition of a word, but just on the word in context. So we see that same question from before about self-contemplation. We see the message that Susie writes is not. And so here, I would assume that if you're taking the ACT, you know what a message means. So we're not looking for the definition of a message. We're just looking for what the message is in accordance with the character Susie and what she's writing. And we see stuff like in the last paragraph, the author implies that being human includes. So how is the author using the word human? Here's some strategies. So we know that context is everything. So again, we don't care about the definition, just how it's used in the passage. You want to reread. Unlike the main idea questions, rereading is going to help you here. So you want to read a full sentence before and after the one in question containing the word. And so this is going to give you an idea of the context, because if you just look at the word, it's really easy to jump to false conclusions. And yet again, there are traps. So there's often a trap answer that's close to the definition of a word, but ignores the context. So if I told you that the Supreme Court worked out a deal with the president, and you chose exercise just because you saw work out and thought exercise, that would not be good. So you really read it and know, oh, okay, we're talking about some sort of deal in government, but we can't use exercise. Let's look at an example from that same passage. We're looking at the word void. And so we know if we're just looking at definitions, a void is an empty space, something that is lacking or missing, but not going to go with a definition. So let's try to, even though we've just talked about that, let's try to forget that. And so let's look at line 27. And in accordance with our strategies, we're going to read a sentence before and a sentence after. The law was struck, and employer personnel practices continued to discriminate against women and children. If in the late 1880s and early 1900s, the Supreme Court felt that the legislator had overstepped constitutional boundaries, those laws were made void. And management continued its harsh management policies, not only toward women and children, but also toward men. So if we're saying that the laws are made void, we're saying that the laws are, they made some laws, but they're going to make them inactive. They're going to make them not count. So let's look for a word that means that. So vacant. We don't make a law vacant. So vacant goes along with that definition of void we have in our heads, but not with void that we see in the passage. Same thing with lacking. It means just empty. Null. So null's going to be pretty good. So you might have heard in your history class, if you're going to nullify a law, nullify a decision, it means that you're going to make it not applicable. So that's probably going to be good. And a bit cool word, it means a bottomless pit, but again, not going to be applicable, so let's go null. Okay, so that's it for vocabulary questions. So they're really not that hard. Don't be intimidated by them. As long as you're reading the sentence, you can pretty easily find the right answer. Let's look at technique questions now. Technique questions have to deal with how the author uses language to convey a point. So we see stuff like the rhetorical device primarily featured in this passage is, the author primarily makes use of which of the following to convey his point. And the answer choices are often a really good way to identify technique questions. We see lots of nouns like defense or allusion or exception, or nouns with adjectives before. So explicit criticism, factual observation. Technique questions, they're not going to have long answer choices because a technique is usually just a definition of a type of strategy used in writing. And so if you see these just nouns or adjective nouns, good chance that it's a technique question. So our first strategy for identifying technique questions is look at the answer choices and see, just guarantee that it's a technique question. And they often look like specific questions, which is just a question that asks about a specific part of the passage. Know the jargon. So this is it's a really good idea to be familiar with words like allusion, anecdote, metaphor, simile, all those types of words, because knowing the jargon will help you more easily choose the correct answer. And if you CT technique questions or something like that, you can pretty easily find a list. And here's some words. You also want a holistic understanding of the passage. So that just means understand the passage as a whole, which you probably have done already by reading the passage and also answering main idea questions. Taking notes will help. And here's an example of a technique question. So which statement best describes the quote in 22 to 23? So we want to see what type of device this quote is. And we're looking here. So we say, a 1923 case dealt with a law that established a board authorized, among other things, to determine minimum wages of female and child workers. In that case, the Supreme Court majority stated that, quote, adult women are legally as capable of contracting for themselves as men. The law was struck and employee personnel practices continued to discriminate against women and children. And so the Supreme Court is saying that women are just as capable as advocating for themselves as men, so we don't need this law. So let's look at our answer choices. An allusion to a universal truth. So an allusion just means a reference, usually in the literary sense, and a universal truth is something that's true all. So this is the Supreme Court majority's thought. It's not something that's definitely true or that's true everywhere. So that's not going to be a good answer choice. Explicit criticism of an enacted law. So this law was struck, which means that it wasn't used. It was made null. So enacted law is going to be bad. Also, explicit criticism. This quote is just saying women are capable. It's not criticizing the law. And we'll often see that negative words like criticism, those kind of things are not good on the ACT. Choice 3, a comparison between women and men. So we see that women are as capable of contracting for themselves as men, but I'd argue that this makes more of a point about women and less of a direct comparison between men and women. That's not the point of it. It's more just talk about women. And yet again, we're left with D. An example in support of a previous statement. And so this example goes along with what the Supreme Court law was trying to establish. So we're trying to establish these wages, minimum wages for women. We see a quote about women, and then the law was struck. So this just follows through, and it's a technique that advances the argument. So choice D is going to be correct. Let's look at a different type of question. So we're looking at attitudes now. And remember, those are the types of opinion or tone questions. So the author's attitude toward the downturn ecosystem is best described as one of, the tone of the first sentence is best characterized as, or the author's approach to discussing Orientalist films is not one. And here are strategies. So again, you want that holistic understanding of the passage we talked about before. So take notes, understand what's going on in the entire passage. You want to look out for extreme language. So it's usually the modifiers, not the subjects and verbs, that set the tone of a passage. And so you're never really going to have a tone question or an attitude question with an answer that's strongly negative or strongly positive. These writers, they write these very dry, kind of boring, neutral passages. So extreme language has no place on the ACT. And here's some examples of tone. Emphatic. There's only one choice. You must go. So emphatic means that you're really strongly conveying a viewpoint, you're putting an emphasis on something. So that's an emphatic tone versus a hesitant tone. Oh, there are many options. You should consider going. Like you're not exactly sure. You're not jumping to give your viewpoint. And here's an example of an attitude question in this passage. So see what values are reflected in the narrative provided by the author. And we only want to choose things that we can definitely see in the passage. We don't want to jump to any conclusions. First one, the author is apparently a religious person because of his emphasis on moral issues. The author very well may be a religious person, but we can't tell that from the passage. That just seems outlandish, so not good. It's an assumption. The author unfairly criticizes capitalism in the United States and is therefore a socialite. First off, let's make a distinction. A socialite is someone like Paris Hilton who comes from a lot of money and goes to a lot of parties, is involved in the social scene. A socialist is someone who has Marxist beliefs and believes that people should not work traditional jobs and should all be equal. And here is that history degree I never earned. So first off, we have a wrong definition. And then we also see the author unfairly criticizing capitalism. So first off, we don't see criticisms of capitalism, and we also don't know, if we don't see these criticisms, we can't make a designation of whether it's fair or not. So that's not good. Choice 3, the author unfairly criticizes, okay, we see this term again, justices who write dissenting opinions and therefore leave laws unsettled. We don't see the criticism, we don't see justices who write these opinions, not good. Oh, wouldn't you know it, it's D. The author's choice of historical facts might lead the reader to consider motives of business and industry, such as profits that led to hiring small children. So we see a lot of historical facts here, and we see Rubin's case all in this paragraph. And we're led to think, okay, maybe hiring children is bad, or hiring children is definitely bad, but perhaps that there were motives, that if a lot of people are doing it, there must be some sort of reason. So choice D is the only one that's even somewhat supported by the passage. Okay, hide and seek questions. So these hide and seek questions, you're just fishing for information. So the passage calls attention to which aspect of the Acholi language. We want to look for Acholi and find out what characteristics. Which of the following features of city life would the narrator most likely want to add to those mentioned in paragraph 2? So this is a little bit easier. We're looking in paragraph 2, our focus is narrowed, and we want to find out what features of city life are we talking about, and then which ones should we add? Or the passage indicates that Black writers and artists were most important to the freedom struggle in that they blank. So we'd want to be finding freedom struggle and find out how Black writers and artists were connected to it. So with a hide and seek question, you want to, well, they're common in paired passages first off. You want to hunt for a specific keyword. So before we saw freedom struggle, and that's an easy thing to find. So we could find freedom struggle and then find any associated information. And yes, specific words are easier to find quickly. You can use your hand to scan faster. So up to you, however you want to use your scanning or skimming technique. Sometimes that can be easier to catch sight of a specific term. And your reading comprehension will be much better, and it'll work outside the ACT. So, other things we care about in different lessons. So let's look at an example of a hide and seek question. In the early 20th century, period here, so I'm going to underline that, what was the role of government in determining wages of women who worked in factories, hospitals, and other businesses? So we're looking first off, so since this piece is going through different time periods, let's find the early 20th century, and that's going to narrow down where we should be looking. So we see in paragraph 2, toward the end of the 19th century and early in the 20th century. Okay, so we're probably looking here. And then we see here, okay, Industrial Revolution. You probably know that from history class. That was a little earlier. This is young Rubin's case, but we want the role of wages of women. And we know that paragraph 2 is early in the 20th century and talks about women. So let's look at our choices. The Supreme Court majority felt the government should not set minimum wages for private employers. So the Supreme Court majority stated that adult women are legally as capable of contracting for themselves as men. So law. So they did feel, but we don't know about the designated private employers versus public employers. We just know about women, so that's not good. Choice B. The legislature was filled with men whose wives did not work. Thus, they were insensitive to the needs of working women. That's potentially true, but we have no mention of men whose wives did not work. And let's remember, we know nothing of the passage where our minds are a tabula rasa, so we can't pick that. That's not good. Choice C. Presidents finally bargained with industrial owners who caved in and established a business board that established minimum wages. I wouldn't say that we know that. So we see a law that established a business board, but we don't see any presidents bargaining with industrial owners, and this law was actually struck, so it didn't happen. Choice D. Some legislators protect economic morals of women by establishing an agency with authority to set minimum wages, but courts abolished the law in the agency. That's exactly what we see. We see that they're trying to establish this law with the board, and they're trying to determine minimum wages, but the law was struck. So choice D is the only one that makes sense based on the information in the passage. So now you've seen a ton of the most common types of questions on the ACT reading section, specifically in the social science section. And so all I can say to you now is go forth and prosper. Should be fairly easy to attack the rest of the test.